Dear students from different programs, doctoral students, students from the MBA program, delegates to the conference, my distinguished colleagues and guests for the conference. It's our honor to have Dr. C. Rangarajan as the keynote speaker for the conference. He has specially flown in for this particular event, so thanks a lot to him for that. I now invite Professor Shashidhar Murthy to give his introduction about Dr. Rangarajan.
Thank you, Saurabh. Dr. Rangarajan, we thank you very much for being with us today. Dr. Rangarajan, our distinguished guest, really needs no introduction, I think, to all of us. But on this occasion, when when we're with all of you here, budding research scholars, people who aspire to contribute to teaching, research, and service, I think it's very appropriate and appropriate to have Dr. Rangarajan with us, and instructive to take a brief look at his many significant accomplishments in all three of those fields, right? So unlike many of us academics who might struggle very hard to make a mark in one or two of those fields, Dr. Rangarajan has made significant contributions in all three. Now, so of course his record in the public space, what people may know of him, what someone as a layman may know of him, is fairly well known. So let me start with drawing attention to his distinguished academic career. He obtained an honors degree from Madras University, then a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, followed immediately thereafter, I believe, by teaching at the Wharton School of Business. He then taught at NYU's School of Business. I don't know if it was called the Stern School in those days. Not at that time, right? And that was then followed by a long stint at IIM Ahmedabad, where he taught some of our colleagues in this room or some of our colleagues in the institute who perhaps didn't get a chance to be here. His research has been extensive across various areas in economics and finance, banking, monetary economics, public finance chiefly. Two studies that are cited more than others is one where he developed a new approach to forecast corporate investment, which was pioneering in its time, and a study of the relationship between agricultural growth and industrial development, which was also a landmark. And of course, then turning to his public service, he has been, of course, as most of us know, Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Chair of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, in two different stints, member of the Planning Commission, Governor of Andhra Pradesh, Chair of the 12th Finance Commission, and has served on numerous committees examining our monetary system, balance of payments, and the like. So with that, and merely pointing out that we have a truly distinguished guest with us, a recipient of the Padma Vibhushan. Once again, thank you, Dr. Rangarajan. It's our hope that his presence here will inspire all of you and us to do better in what we set out to do.
Distinguished professors and the participants in this conference. It gives me great pleasure to be in your midst this morning. It is an excellent idea to get students who are doing research, working towards a PhD, to come together and exchange ideas. Increasingly, whether it is economics or management or operations research, the extent of application has widened. We are addressing newer and newer problems with the tools that are developed. Looking at economics, a discipline with which I am associated, today economic analysis is being applied to examine and analyze a wide variety of problems which were not addressed much earlier. It used to be the standard subdisciplines of economics were limited. but today they are very, very extensive. So whether it is economics or management or other fields, what is extremely important is that you learn how to address a problem, how to analyze a problem, and how to reach appropriate conclusions regarding the problem that is posed to it. What Lord Keynes said about economics is applicable to others, and he said about economics in his introduction to the Cambridge Handbook series, and said, it's a method rather than a doctrine, an apparatus of mind, a technique of thinking which enables its possessor to draw correct conclusions. So what you are aiming at is a technique of thinking and an apparatus of mind, and I'm quite sure that your conference today will be extremely fruitful. When I was invited to come here, I thought that there are many things about which one can speak. I have chosen to speak about the Indian economy, what I may call the immediate concerns and the medium-term challenges. It's a large area to cover, so I will take about approximately 30 or 35 minutes from now on, outline some of the key issues, and then leave you some time for you to ask questions. The Indian economy is currently passing through a phase of relatively low growth. We need to address the issues which have been responsible for this slow growth, because it is only by correcting the reasons or the causes we might be able to get back to the high growth that we had seen earlier. Nevertheless, it should not cloud the fact that over the decade beginning 2004-5, the average annual rate of the growth of the economy has been 7.5%. Nor should we underestimate the structural changes that have occurred in the Indian economy over the last 2 decades. I do believe that the Indian economy today is more competitive and more resilient than what it was. Also, we should not completely ignore the impact of what is happening in the rest of the world on the Indian economy. Even though I do not attribute external factors as being responsible or the major factor responsible for the slowdown in growth, but we cannot also brush aside the impact of the external factors on the economy. In many ways, 1991 is an important landmark in the post-independent economic history of the country. The country faced an acute economic crisis triggered by a severe balance of payments problem. The crisis was converted into an opportunity to bring about some fundamental changes in India's economy. Many of you may not be fully aware of the system that existed prior to 1991 and the system that we now have. There is a common thread running through the various measures introduced since 1991, and that is to improve the productivity and the efficiency of the system by injecting a greater element of competition. And this is sought to be achieved by removing the barriers to entry and growth. Dismantling of the controls, dismantling or doing away with permits of various types, all happened post-1991. While changes in industrial policy, such as the dismantling of the controls, was intended to increase the internal competitiveness of Indian industry, changes in trade policy, such as the reduction in the tariff levels, doing away with quantitative restrictions, were intended to improve the external competitiveness of Indian industry. No doubt the private sector is being offered a larger space in which to operate. Many areas which were reserved exclusively for the public sector are now thrown open to the private sector. Classic examples are steel, aviation, power, and so on. Most of these areas prior to 1991 were the exclusive privilege of the public sector. However, I should say there is nothing in the new economic policy which takes away the role of the state. In any economy, the state or the government can play three roles: as a producer of marketable goods and services, 2, as a regulator, 3, as a producer of public goods and services. The role of state as a producer of marketable goods and services has come down. But at the same time, the role of the state as a regulator and the role of the state as a provider of certain kinds of public goods, such as elementary education and health, have increased. As somebody said, critically remarked, more market does not mean less government, but only different government. Coming back to the growth story. In the period beginning 2003-4, as I mentioned earlier, the average annual rate of growth is 7.6%. But the best period that we had was beginning 2005-6. And between 2005-6 and 2007-8, the average annual rate of the growth of the economy exceeded 9%. And in the wake of the economic crisis or the international financial crisis of 2008, the growth rate came down to 6.7% in 2008-9, after growing, as I just now mentioned, at a rate exceeding 9% for 3 consecutive years. But the recovery from the shock of the international financial crisis was swift and sharp. And in 2009-10, the growth rate was 8.6%, and 2010-11, it was 8.9%. In fact, we had not anticipated such a sharp rise. And in fact, if we had anticipated it, perhaps we could have withdrawn some of the concessions which we had introduced in 2008-9 a little earlier. And that could have moderated the inflationary pressures that emerged at that particular time. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that up to 2010-11, the Indian growth rate was still as high as 8.9%. In 2011-12, it came down to 6.7%. In 2012-13, it came down to 4.5%, and 2013-14, it came down to 4.7%. For the first time, almost, in the post-liberalization period, the growth rate fell below 5% in the 2 years that I mentioned. Why? And 2 interesting questions arise in this particular context. What happened and why the growth rate fell? Now, as far as the current year is concerned, the growth rate is expected to be 5.5%. The first half of the year has shown a growth rate of 5.5%. There could be some pickup in industrial production in the second half, but agricultural production will be modest because the monsoon had not been that good. And the service sector may not also show any sharp increase over previous year. So taking all these factors into account, the growth rate in the current year could be 5.5%. But this is a long cry from what we had in between 2005 and 2007-8. What happened? And in this particular context, one interesting question that arises is, what is the potential rate of growth of the Indian economy? Can the Indian economy grow at 8 to 9%, which is our ambition? Now, if you look at the factors that might have contributed to the decline in the growth rate since 2011-12, 3 factors are attributed. One was there were supply bottlenecks. For example, 2009-10, there was a decline in agricultural production, particularly in food grain. The coal production fell. Iron ore output fell because of court decisions and so on. Therefore, there were supply bottlenecks that developed. And then there were price shocks. In fact, international commodity prices, contrary to what we are seeing today, were rising at that particular time. In fact, it was felt at that time because of the financial crisis. The international commodity prices, particularly oil prices, will come down because the growth was not picking up in the developed countries. But contrary to that, commodity prices, including oil prices, started rising at that time. And third, of course, there was a weakening of the investment demand. And investment rate, I shall come to presently, fell down very sharply. Why was there a weakening of the investment demand? There were economic and non-economic factors responsible for that. There was a feeling that developed among the industrialists and the entrepreneurs that the government decision-making process was not quick enough, was beset with many problems. This was a time when many issues, such as graft and corruption, surfaced in the polity, and it absorbed the energies of the government. And consequently, there were occasions on which people felt that the decision-making process within the government was not moving fast enough, was in fact slowing down. And there were also economic reasons. One cannot hide the fact that the decision of the government in its budget to give with retrospective effect certain changes in tax laws, or also its impact on investment sentiment. It is true that that particular provision did not affect most of the corporates. I mean, I think that they were not in that, they were not the directly hit by the change in the tax law. But the very fact that the government could change the tax law with a retrospective effect had a very disastrous effect upon investor sentiment. And therefore, the investment rate fell. The weakening of the investment demand and resulted in a fairly sharp decline in corporate investment. In fact, corporate investment fell from 14.26% of the GDP in 2007-8 to something like 8.46% or 8.5% subsequently in 2011-12 or 12-13. Therefore, it is a very sharp decline of almost 6% of GDP in investment. Let me get back to the earlier question that I said. What is the potential rate of growth of the Indian economy? How does one determine the potential rate of growth of the economy? Usually, economists and others decide the potential rate of the growth of the economy by looking at the trend. They can filter the trend in a number of ways, but they basically look at the trend. Some people look at the maximum rate of growth that was achieved in the economy as a potential. If that particular rate of growth in that particular year was not a one-off event, if there is reason to believe that that rate of growth was something that could be sustained over a period of time, then that was also taken. For example, some of you who do work on capacity utilization take the maximum capacity as the maximum output achieved in a particular period. Similarly, one could do that. Therefore, the 9% rate of growth was not achieved just in 1 year. The 9% plus was achieved in 3 consecutive years, showing that the economy had that potential. In one other way of looking at it is, what are the factors that determine the growth rate of the economy? There are a number of factors that could influence the growth rate of the economy. But economists abstract them and say that the growth rate of the economy is equal to the investment rate of the economy divided by what we call the incremental capital output ratio. This is a famous Harrod-Domar equation which they call G is equal to S over V. S standing for savings or investment rate, and V standing for the capital output ratio or the incremental capital output ratio. Therefore, if an economy, let us say, is able to save 20% of its GDP in the form of investment, and if the incremental capital output ratio is 4:1, then the rate of growth of the economy is 5%. It's very simple. If the economy is able to invest 20%, and for producing 1 unit of output you require 4 units of capital, then 20% translates into 5%. Therefore, what I have tried to do is to look at the investment and savings rate of the economy and what has happened. Now, in 2007-8, the investment rate of the economy was 38%. It comes to a very simple arithmetic. If 38% was the investment rate and the incremental capital output ratio of 4:1, then the growth rate was 9.5. That's what we got. And the incremental capital output ratio has been 4:1 for a number of years during that particular period. Now, there is also in investment rate several components. The gross investment rate comprises of 3 elements. One is gross fixed capital formation rate, and the other is inventories or the change in stocks, and the third is valuables. What do you mean is that if you save or invest in gold, that is another element, but that doesn't really generate income. Therefore, the best way to look at it is gross fixed capital formation rate, and that gross fixed capital formation rate, once again, was 33% in 2007-8, and by 2012-13, it came down to 30%, and according to a recent estimate, it is something like 28%. A good question to ask is, if the investment rate was 30% or 28%, why did we get a growth rate less than 5%? With an investment rate of 30% or 28%, if the incremental capital output ratio had remained 4:1, we should have got a growth rate of 7 to 7.5%. But we got a growth rate of less than 5%. The lesson that I draw from an analysis of the savings and investment rate is, yes, the decline in the investment rate has contributed to the slowdown in growth rate. Definitely true. But the decline in growth rate is even stronger than the decline in the investment rate, and that is because of the increase in the incremental capital output ratio, or can we say, to put it the other words, the decline in the productivity of capital. If the productivity of capital had remained the same, even though the investment rate had declined to 30% or 28%, we would have got a growth rate of 7 to 7.5%. It is the combined effect of a decline in investment rate and a fall in the productivity of capital, which led to a growth rate which is below 5%. Now we can ask, put it the other way around. If the economy is making 28 to 30% of its GDP in the form of investment, why is it we did not get this output or growth? That is because of the delay in the completion of projects. Could be because either delay in the completion of projects or the lack of complementary investments, or also due to the non-availability of critical inputs. People have talked about the delay in the completion of projects. The delay in the completion of projects have has played a role. And this delay in the completion of projects has also something to do with policy. If environmental considerations and issues relating to land acquisition have come in the way of the speedy completion of the projects, we need to take into account that. Therefore, the delay in the completion of projects could be at various levels, at the policy making level as well as at the micro level. It may be very interesting to look at the various projects that have been stalled and analyze them in terms of what contributed to the delay in the completion of projects. Second, of course, lack of complementary investments. Unless the increased capacity creation in power sector is matched by increased capital investment in the coal sector, the lack of synchronization between the two can also cause problems. As I mentioned earlier, the coal production actually did not grow in this particular period. And that is one of the reasons why, even though capacity was added to the power creation, the output did not happen. And that could also be attributed to what I said, the second one. The third one, lack of availability of critical inputs. Therefore, for example, non-availability of gas has led, for example, to several thousand megawatts of power capacity created lying idle. Therefore, the argument is that, quickly speaking, we need to raise the investment rate. We need to raise the productivity of capital. We need to reduce the delay in the completion of projects. And if we do all of that, we can get back to 8 to 9%. But even at our current level, this is a point that I have been repeatedly making, even at our current levels of savings and investment rate, we can get back to 7 to 7.5% if we find our way to the speedy completion of projects. On this, as I mentioned earlier, there are micro level problems and macro policy level problems. On environment, I'm not the one who wants to compromise with environmental considerations. They are critically important. But we need to work out a balance. We need to work out a compromise between the compulsions of the growth and the concerns for environment. Similarly, in the case of land acquisition too, we need to see that the landowners are paid adequately and paid reasonably. And at the same time, we should be able to speed up the process of land acquisition. I think the new act, by and large, is good. But what is the problem with the new land act is basically the procedures that have been built into the legislation, which can result in a great amount of delay in the acquisition of a land. Let me spend the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes on what I consider to be the immediate concerns and what I consider to be the medium-term challenges. I think stability in the economy is important for ensuring faster growth. And stability has 3 dimensions: price stability, external stability, and fiscal stability. All the 3 are important. Price stability is something that we have not had until recently. From almost beginning 2009-10, we have had high levels of inflation. To give you only one number, the wholesale price inflation in April 2009 was 1.2%. Then came the shock towards the end of calendar year 2009, and in April 2010, the inflation rate was 10.9%. In April 2011, it was 9.7. In April 2012, it was 7.5%. So you can see for 3 years continuously, the inflation remaining at a very high level. Subsequently, it came down, but it was not stable enough, and it kept rising and falling in between, and then it's only recently, as you all know, the inflation has come down on the wholesale level at 0%, and at the CPI level, it is about 4.4%. CPI had always remained at a much higher level than WPI throughout this particular period. Two or three interesting questions arise, and I will post the questions and leave them there because this is a topic by itself as to understand what caused inflation and what measures should have been taken. It is true that inflation during this particular period was triggered by food inflation. That the supply shocks in agriculture were primarily responsible for triggering inflation. Obviously, when there are supply shocks, we need to look at supply side of the problem and try to remedy it. But that does not mean that there is no role for monetary and fiscal policy in such a situation. When food inflation persists long enough, it gets generalized. It leads to wage push inflation elsewhere, and so on. Therefore, we need to, I think people forget the fact that manufacturing inflation between March 2010 and November 2011 rose to 8.3%. Subsequently, it has come down, and the non-food manufacturing has been hovering around more recent period 2.5. But if food inflation persists long enough, it pushes the wages, and therefore we really need to act. And therefore, I do not agree with the proposition of people that monetary policy or fiscal policy at one step removed has no role to play because inflation has been triggered by supply side factors. There is a demand factor at that time. In fact, please remember, theoretically speaking, if your income remains the same, and if the price of one set of commodities rise, then the amount available for spending on the rest of the commodities becomes less, and therefore the prices will have to fall down. It is only because the overall demand pressures continue to increase that it is not compensated, and the other prices also start increasing. Therefore, I believe that monetary policy and fiscal policy have a role to play even under these conditions. Now, only one, on the food inflation side, there have been, if you look at the food inflation, you see changes in the trigger elements. In 2009-10, the food inflation was food grain inflation. Food grain prices went up. But in the subsequent years, it is not food grain inflation. It is a rise in the price of vegetables. It is in the rise in the price of eggs, meat, and fish. So there are 2 years in which the primary cause is the rise in the price of vegetables. And in the current year or something, it is really the drop in the price of vegetables, very sharp reduction, which has also led to a lower food inflation and to a lower headline inflation. Therefore, we really need to address some of the problems which are inherent with respect to supply bottlenecks in agriculture. In the case of food grain, it is always the shortage in supply or the fall in supply which triggers it. But in the case of vegetables or meat, fish, and egg, I have shown it in one of my papers, they have all been increasing at the rate of 4 to 5% per annum. It is really the demand is outstripping the supply growth. And therefore, we need to address that issue. Therefore, as far as food inflation is concerned, we need to address the issue of improving the productivity of agriculture, and also at the same time need to do something about agricultural marketing. The next issue is, of course, the balance of payments and the need for stability in the external sector. In some ways, the stability in the internal sector, price stability, as also a favorable factor on external stability. In fact, in the pure purchasing power parity theory approach, basically the exchange rate determination is influenced by the inflation rates in the two countries. But where capital flows come in, that proposition does not hold good. In fact, for a long time, the exchange rate of the rupee remained subdued, did not rise, despite a high level of current account deficit and so on, because the capital flows came in and offset it. To come back to the point, once again, the balance of payments situation, the issues relating to balance of payments are long, and I cannot address them in great detail. But let me quickly point out a few numbers. The current account deficit remained very low almost until the 2008-9. It was less than or about close to 2% of the GDP. It is only in 2010-11 it went to 2.7% of the GDP. And the real problem came in 2011-12 when it went to 4.2% of GDP and continued to remain high in 2012-13 when it was 4.8% of a GDP. Why? Very quickly, in one or two sentences, I will say, and then we will move on. One, of course, is the fact that the export growth in 2011-12 was good, but export growth in 2012-13 was very modest. In 2011-12, oil prices rose and the import bill went up by something like 50%. The POL import bill went up by 50%. And added to it was the extraordinary increase in the import of gold, which all of you know. From something like $43 billion in the previous year, it went up to $56 billion in that year. In fact, 43 billion itself is very high. It was much lower in the previous years. Coal import went up because I mentioned earlier the coal production fell, and therefore to compensate for it, the coal output went up. Therefore, it is a combination of the steep increase in the import of coal, oil, and more particularly gold. Now, why did the gold import increase? We Indians, or Indian women, shall I say, have a fascination for gold. And that is inbuilt. I mean, that is something that we cannot, it is something that one will have to overcome over a period of time, but that is always there. But what has added to the demand for gold is the demand for gold as an asset, as a hedge against inflation. As the return on financial assets came down, and as the gold prices were rising, there was an attraction for gold as an asset. It is that which I think, which added to the normal import of gold. I would attribute something like $20 to $25 billion worth of gold to the attraction of gold as an asset. As inflation comes down, and as the return on financial assets become more attractive, I believe that $20 billion of extra import of gold can come down, then we might be in a position to be able to manage. Then there is only one other issue that I want to highlight. In 2012-13, when we had a current account deficit of $88 billion, there were no alarm bells in the country. That is because in that particular year, the total capital inflows into the country was $91 billion. We added $3.2 billion to our reserves in that year. Exactly the contrary thing happened in 2013-14. When, after the famous statement regarding the tapering coming to an end. Then on May 22nd, 2013, capital started flowing out of India. In fact, in the 3 months, June, July, and August, the capital outflow was $13 billion, while the current account deficit remained high. There was a capital outflow, and that is what led to a sudden sharp in the price of the rupee, that is in the value of the rupee. Then we took action, more particularly with respect to curtailing the import of gold. There were actions taken by the Reserve Bank of India to attract capital flows. But things also turned better because subsequently a statement was made that the tapering will not come to an abrupt end and it will take time and so on, and therefore the sentiment changed and capital flows started coming in. And we ended up the year with 1.7% of the GDP. That's a very low level of current account deficit. In the current year, I cannot go into detail. I'm already running out of time. So let me only say that the data that are available up to April, November show a current account deficit or show a trade deficit which is more or less equal to last year. That is because of the sudden spurt in the import of gold in the last 2 months. Even though oil prices have come down, oil import bill is coming down very sharply. One is moderating the other, but therefore the current account deficit this year could remain more or less at last year's level. I believe that going ahead, we should work towards a current account deficit which is much lower. Normally 2 to 2.5% of the GDP is considered to be acceptable. In fact, that amount of capital flows into the country will also come in, because 2 to 2.5% of the GDP will be in the range of $40 to $45 billion. That amount of capital flows can normally come into the country. But given the fact that capital flows are subject to violent fluctuations, we need to work with current account deficit which is even lower. Therefore, what we really need to create an environment in which exports can grow and the need for imports can be avoided. This should not be done by direct restrictions. We should not go back to the pre-91 days. We should create the policy environment within the country which will do this. That is why price stability is important. Fiscal stability is important. In fact, the current account deficit is the mirror image of the difference between savings and investment. Therefore, we need to raise the savings rate. And we should also create the conditions in which the production of some of the important goods will go up, like coal and so on. In fact, some people are telling me that if the use of the mobile phones and the electronic goods in this country goes up at the rate at which it has been going up in the recent period, the biggest import in 5 years from now could happen to be the electronic goods. We need to create the appropriate production vehicles, production centers here. Now, the third element is fiscal deficit. I am not going to talk about it, but I do find that there is somebody who is working on public debt also for his doctoral dissertation. I would only say that on public debt in India, the paper that I wrote was one of the earliest on the subject. In fact, it even predates Buter's article. We worked out as to why a rising level of public debt and a fiscal deficit is harmful to the economy. Now, let me read. I am just going to finish in 2-3 minutes. I'll give you at least 10 minutes to ask questions. As far as the medium-term challenges are concerned, let me list 3 of them. One, we need to focus attention on agriculture. The last 2-3 years have shown, even though agriculture contributes only something like 18% to the total GDP. It still plays a critical role. 60% of the people still live in the rural areas. And disruptions in the agricultural supply cause price inflation. And therefore, we really need to work on it. And in this case, we need to work both on improving the productivity of agriculture, as well as improving the agricultural marketing. Agricultural marketing is in an archaic situation. Some of you here must be doing work on marketing, and you should take a look at the vegetable market system in our country. I think we really need to break the monopoly that exists there. And that is one of the reasons why there is a big difference in the prices of vegetables at the retail level and the prices at which the prices which go to the producer. We had in fact recommended that APMC Act should be amended to allow the major procurers to go directly to the farmers and procure. In fact, the APMC Act was introduced in order to support the farmers, but it has turned out to be something which is against them, particularly in the case of perishables. Second, of course, is the power sector and infrastructure. People in this state and people in the neighboring state of Tamil Nadu know very well what the impact of the power shortage is. It is true that in the 12th plan, in the 11th plan, we added 50% more than what we added to capacity in the 10th plan. In the 12th plan, we are aiming at a capacity creation of 75,000 megawatts of power. But even that is not enough. We need to go ahead and produce enough power in the country. And we need to note that China adds to capacity creation in 1 year what we had in 5 years. That is the magnitude of difference between us and them, and we really need to work on it. And the third area is, of course, cutting across all is governance. I think this has become an extremely important issue. At the cutting edge, it is the delivery of services that counts, and we need accountable institutions. We need professional integrity. All this is critically important as the role of the state continues to remain still important. I think the idea that state will wither away, which what Marx and Engels thought at one time, will never happen. The only thing is the functions of the state will vary. And therefore, whatever it does, it must do efficiently. And therefore, governance becomes extremely important. We need ideas, we need programs, we need a commitment to implement programs. And that is why ideas, programs, and implementation constitutes the triad of good governance and therefore of faster economic growth. Something else that I wanted to talk also was about what the reform agenda should be going ahead. But I will only say that I'll go back to the roots of our liberalization policy, and that is to create a competitive environment in the country. And I think that rule should be applied as far as possible. There are still segments of Indian industry, segments of the Indian economy which are still under which do not operate under a competitive environment. A typical example is the sugar industry. The mess in which we are is because of the lack of competitiveness there. And the other is, of course, pricing issue of both of natural resources, and the pricing issue is also related to subsidies, which need to be controlled. Let me conclude by saying that the coming decade will be crucial for India. Only if India grows at the rate of 8 to 9%, India's per capita GDP will grow in PPP terms from the current $1,600 to $8,000 to $10,000. Only then, and I underline the word only then India will graduate from being a low-income country into a middle-income country. And that is why growth is extremely important. In the recent years, we have introduced many safeguards and social safety nets. And that was only possible because of the growth in the economy and the resources that are available. Development has many dimensions. It must reduce poverty. It must be environment friendly. Nevertheless, growth is extremely important. At this present stage, we cannot sacrifice growth. We need to build it into our development process. Growth and equity should not be posed as opposing considerations. They must be weaved together to produce a coherent pattern of development, and therein lies economic statesmanship. Thank you very much.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Our doctoral student, Pavan Soni, yes?
So thank you, sir. It was one of the most informative sessions I have had in a long time. My question is about the investments, and I'm more alluding to the quality of investments. So what has recently happened is that many of these MNCs are pulling out their R&D investments from India because they deem that the intellectual property rights environment in India is not conducive for them, and more so the pharmaceutical industry. So we have had the cases of Supreme Court not granting licenses to companies. So what is your thought on improving the property rights regime in India? And more specifically, how do we ensure that the quality of investment goes up?
Well, your question is very specific on intellectual property rights. But as you know, as the Supreme Court judgment was not concerned with R&D in general, because the major issue that came up for determination was whether a marginal increase in the quality of the drug or any other product entitles them to get the same kind of protection. I think this has been an issue elsewhere too, and the court has taken a particular decision, and this depends upon an analysis case by case. I mean, there is no general opinion that can be offered. But I think the general view is that by making minor modifications, you can make the protection eternal. And that is why they are saying that when you want to give protection, it has to be in terms of a certain depth in terms of innovation. Now that, of course, it requires to be determined by some authority and so on. But the whole question is, it is the quality of investment in the sense that, as I mentioned, the investment rate went down. But the investment rate went down much less than the fall in the corporate investment rate. What happened is corporate investment rate fell almost by 8.5%. But the household investment, for example, went up by about 6%. And therefore, the fall in the overall investment rate was about only 2%. But actually, the investment by household is basically in houses and so on and so forth. That is not as productive as the corporate investment, which has fallen, which is more productive. I think we really need to ensure. I think we need more housing. We need to do that. But at the same time, when you talk about the quality of investment, it also, we need to focus on who is making the investment in what.
Excuse me, sir. Yeah, here, sir.
Where,
Yeah, it's very nice to be here because I got opportunity and I listen you very live. I always saw you on the news channel and I read your articles and all. So it's we are very lucky. We really, we welcome you from core of the heart, sir. Thank you very much to be here.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Razi Anwar. I am from Maulana Azad University, Hyderabad. Actually, sir, maybe that my question would not be relevant to that topic you have explained. But as you said that we don't have saving, there's no investment. It's true. So from that banking point of view, because I have read your article and all about from the banking, and you have given instruction to the banking also regarding the inclusion of financial inclusion to the people of India. So from that point of view, I would like to talk to you because wherever I spoke, the people thought it or they took it as a community point of view. So my request to everybody to take it either as a scholar point of view or from economist point of view or Indian economy point of view. My question is that I have worked with banks And when I did my MBA, then I worked with bank. And after that, I left that job. There's a reason. And then I joined a Master of Philosophy program. Then I did my research in exclusion of Muslim community by bank in Hyderabad. The reason was that because I had a very bad experience when I was working with the bank.
Can I
So-
interrupt? We are running short of time.
Yeah,
Could you
yeah,
please
sure,
get your
sure.
question
Sure,
quickly?
sure. So my question is that, so that a part of the people or a community or area of the India or a area is being excluded by the banking people, because whenever they go to the bank, they are said that no, sorry, this is negative area, we cannot give you this facility. Let it be whatever, because we have already given instruction that no free account and credit card and other money lending should be given to them. But the banking people said, no, this is the negative area. Even my father got this experience very badly. When we went for some kind of, to purchase some product, they said, no, we cannot issue because the negative area. So until or unless we are not adding them to this financial inclusion, so how far we can think that India will definitely grow from the economic point of view? This is my question, sir. And second question is that what is your view about the Islamic banking in India? That's it, sir. Thank you very much. Hope I'll get answer.
If I start answering your second question, we'll go into lunch. Therefore, let me answer you the first question. I think the very word inclusion is meant to take every segment of the society and every part of the society into the organized banking fold.
Right.
Now, if that is not happening because of the attitude or something, we need to change the attitude. But what we are trying, or what the government is trying to do, is to introduce institutional changes which will help or which will embrace all sections of the community. Now, I do think that the idea of a small bank is a good idea. In my time, we had initiated what we call the LABs, a local area bank. We thought that if banks are set up with a smaller capital, but prudential norms being more or less the same, and focused on a particular area, let us say 2 or 3 contiguous districts or 2 districts, then it will be in a position to be able to focus on the problems of the people in that particular country. So what we can really do is 2 things. Introduce institutional changes, and also at the same time do whatever we can to bring about attitudinal changes. Islamic banking, I think it's a much wider subject. I think it's experimentation is good, but the way in which it will be implemented in the context of a banking legislation that we now have needs to be studied.
Some more? Yes.
See, one of the reasons for this decline in this capital, it seems to me, as a decline in the productivity, capital output ratio, is could be because of large-scale investment by government agencies. So where we are told there is a considerable leakage is occurring.
Well, I'm not very sure that when you look at the stalled projects, they are necessarily the stalled projects in the government sector. Because many of the things that you talk about of leakages and all are not treated as part of the capital investment. I mean, I think, for example, the public distribution system about which people talk about, these are not included in the as part of investment. I mean, I think these are the current expenditures of the government of India. Therefore, there is that aspect of the problem, namely, what is the impact of the government expenditures and how effective government expenditures can be made. But as far as the stalled projects are concerned, they are in all ranges. I mean, they're all, I was once asked to look at the road projects, for example, and the road projects is in a public-private mode. And then, as you know, when the road has to pass through a forest area, it may go through only a stretch of, let's say, even 5, 6 miles or 10 miles. But if the clearance is not there, the road is not completed. Then that is why a modification was made. In the case of linear projects, the environmental rules will not apply. But that is after we found out that the road projects had been delayed. Therefore, the stalling of the projects have been due to a variety of reasons. I mean, that is why I would like people who study here to look at a few projects and find out how much macro policy decisions were responsible, how micro decisions, or at the micro level, what are the deficiencies and so on. But it is not just, the stalling is not just in the public sector alone. It is there all through, across the sector.
It may not be due to the stalling of the projects, but we are told that the public investments, in flyovers, you build flyovers even where it is not required. And 30% of that, necessarily has to be set aside for getting the order. We hear things like that.
No, I think that is why I'm saying that we need to analyze and study each one of the projects and see how much, as I said, policy level problems are there, and how, or what are the other constraints that have come in the way, and so on. But there is a reason to believe, for example, in the case of power projects, there are many of them which have been delayed well beyond their completion date because of some of the major environmental concerns.
Dr. T.R. Ramakrishnan. My question directly is, how would you develop the economic policy or amend the existing policies with respect to the present scenario up to from 2015, 14-15 to 2050, you get to notice the mean age group of the population in India is the young spenders, aspiring spenders. But the threat is the employment scenario would drop with the attraction of FDIs to meet the FDI institutional goals, superseding the nation's control system in policy, and the negative growth in manufacturing sector, which is indigenized in the country, and the takeover of the manufacturing goods by the neighboring country, China. What would be the aspiration of the mean age group of people till 2050 for two aspects? Would they still be adaptable to find a job, or should they be entrepreneurs? What should the nation address for economic growth by these two?
No, there are many, many strands in your question. I think obviously we are a young country in that sense of the term. By 2025 or 2030, nearly 70% of the India's population will be what we call young population. Unlike the other countries like Japan and others, which are really aging. Therefore, we need to really expand our employment opportunities. But I believe that growth is the answer to it. I mean, it's only when you grow fast, you will be able to provide for larger employment opportunities. In this case, I mean, the only issue is that which sector of the economy should grow. I do not think that it is only the manufacturing sector which absorbs people. In fact, the service sector, which is much more labor intensive than even the manufacturing sector. But the manufacturing sector has the ability to absorb people of various abilities, from the menial level to a highly qualified level. Whereas the service sector very often seems to use only the people with higher talents. So there is some difference there. But otherwise, we need to see agriculture grow, we need to see manufacturing grow, we need the service sector to grow. I do not particularly subscribe to the idea that the manufacturing sector should contribute 25% of the GDP by a certain time. I think this is putting a limit on the growth of other sectors. I think all the sectors must grow. Whichever sector is capable of growing faster, it should do so. Therefore, the only answer to your question is that faster economic growth is the answer to our social economic problems.
Just one last quick question, Sayantan, provided it's a quick one.
My question is that we have got several clues that the inequality and the agricultural surplus, that is not the income of 40% or 50% of our population is still agriculture, but still their income is less than 30%. So, and also the market, as we have discussed, the market is poor. So is government putting enough stress on that policy of creating markets, maybe employing technologies, creating e-mandis and creating direct procurement? Isn't it a lack, isn't the government policy lacking in style?
I think agricultural marketing is is an area which requires attention, because basically what we are saying is that there is a wide divergence between the price that the consumers pay and what the producers get. And therefore, that is why we need to improve the marketing arrangements. But as I said, the APMC Act was introduced in order to improve the conditions of the farmers. It is not to reduce their conditions. But some of the conditions relating to the APMC Act are not acting in favor of the farmers. It's only coming in the way of the farmers getting the benefit. So we really need to organize ourselves. And I think in the critical areas of food grain or related agricultural commodities, we need to set up a network of retail institutions in this country. For example, in the case of milk, we found some solution. Now what has happened really is the success of the cooperative movement has also led to the success of the private sector in that particular area. The private sector is not exploitative because there is a competing cooperative sector. Similarly, in the case of a limited number of commodities, a network of retail institutions, retail sales should be established. I mean, in the case of many, many commodities, what you call fast-moving consumption goods and all that, the marketing arrangements are there already, and that is the lookout of those people. In the case of essential commodities, we can create a network of institutions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rangarajan, for your insightful remarks. I'm sure our audience here would have wanted more time with you, but we must move on. We have lunch that will be served just outside. But before we take a break, I request Dr. Rangarajan to please accept this small token of appreciation for his time.